Hello, I'm Gina Florzak, Manager of Content Strategy and Publications with the CSAM Institute. Welcome to today's webinar, 2024 Market Outlook for Commercial Real Estate. In this webinar, we'll take a look at the top economic factors facing commercial real estate in 2024. We'll also get a look ahead at key figures like regional job growth, inflation and monetary policy, cap rates, vacancies, and rent growth. We're about to provide you with insights to grow your business today and into the future. Please feel free to ask questions throughout using the Q&A tab. We'll be answering as many as we can at the end of the presentation. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please use the chat feature to ask for help. The recording and accompanying presentation will be emailed to all registered attendees. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Lawrence Yun, Chief Economist with the National Association of Realtors. Lawrence, thank you for being with us today. I'll turn it on over to you.
Great. Thank you, Gina, for inviting me, organizing for the CCIM members. The market condition, I will try to lay out the logic based on what you can anticipate, but also to develop those logic, we have to go through some history on the data points economy and some of the remarks that Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, has been making. So I am here in Washington, D.C., and like any other major cities, New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Seattle, the downtown is less active now than before. The traffic right behind me should be jam-packed, but it's fairly light because I guess this is the new COVID environment. Office market, as we all know, facing challenges, or you can even say tremendous challenges out there. Yet on other properties, we are continuing to see net absorption being positive, and consequently the demand for leasing activity. I'm sure some are interested in purchasing property, some transaction activity also possibly developing as economy continue to grow. So let's go into the very first chart and then we go from there. So let's first start from the interest rate condition, the monetary policy. I put 3 lines. The green line is not for you and me, it's the central bank policy interest rate, Fed funds rate, the short-term interest rate for the banking system. The blue line is prime rate. Some of your client, best client, if they have to borrow money, they will be borrowing at that prime rate. But on many of the commercial real estate, including the CMBS security loans, would follow the red line. Red line is the 10-year Treasury yield. It doesn't move in lockstep 1-to-1, but overall condition, what this chart is showing that, which begins from 2019, is that 2019 versus today, we have higher interest rate environment to the extent that we may say 2019 was a normal year before COVID. In the middle is COVID lockdown, the Great Panic, and Federal Reserve going all in with zero interest rate policy on the green line in the hopes that other interest rates go down, and the red line did initially go down before you see the recent pickup that occurred from middle of 2022. Because the green line shot up, pushing up other interest rate. So clearly today's interest rate environment much higher compared to before. Now the relevancy of some of the people in the audience would be that you have to refinance or suggest refinancing. So people borrow money before at cheap. Now as they are refinancing at much higher interest rate. And in some cases, especially office properties with the lower collateral value, therefore some of the lender may be very hesitant to refinance those mortgages. If we look at the consumer interest rate, so this is not related to business, but say your personal situation or looking at the broader economy, consumer spending impact. Higher interest rate has brought up other interest rates, including credit card, blue line. Current credit card interest rate is averaging at around 22%. And you add that with the late payment fees. I mean, these are huge charges that consumers are facing. Now, if it's a college student, they should not have a credit card. But we also have many families who are trying to make ends meet, paycheck to paycheck. Sometimes the money does not really make it up. Therefore, they resort to credit card, and now they are getting hammered from this Federal Reserve interest rate hike policy. Personal loans, the red line. So you need to take out some personal loan for whatever reason that you need to do. Well, interest rate before COVID was about 10%. Now it's running close to 13%. Even trying to get an automobile loan. So using a 60-month typical new car auto loan interest rate, as you can see, much, much higher. So higher interest rate could potentially pull back consumer spending. We all know consumer spending is the largest, the biggest portion of the GDP, broader economy. So higher interest rate may pull back some of the consumer spending. Maybe this is what the Federal Reserve wants. Federal Reserve, they want to slow down the economy in order to contain the inflation. So higher interest rate, well, it's going to impact some business activity, but it will also impact consumer activity, as you can see on this consumer interest rates. Now, another side on the condition related to consumers is that because of record high home prices, not commercial real estate, but those who are owning residential properties, along with stock prices essentially at near record high condition, the total asset, the blue line, is at, you see on the chart, record high condition. The red is total liability, things like residential mortgages, credit card loans, other liability. So the gap would represent total wealth. So you see how sizable the wealth is. Now, some people may say stock market wealth is skewed towards the wealthy, so which means that if there is a high wealth, say Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Oprah Winfrey, they get additional stock market wealth. Well, they're not going to change their spending habits because stock market among the super wealthy really do not change their spending habits. Of course, they are buying luxurious items, but they don't suddenly say they want to buy more stuff because of higher stock prices. What is more impactful for consumer spending is really the following chart. This is household real estate net worth. So consumers, especially middle-class homeowners, when the home values rises, they feel comfortable that their retirement savings is rising due to their home values. So they can afford to buy that extra furniture, go out on vacation. So given that we have record high home prices, along with corresponding high real estate net worth, this is where consumer spending growth may continue. The middle class consumer spending is important, and middle class homeowners, not renters, but homeowners, they are in a good shape. People who are borrowing from credit card, maybe they're renters, so they're stretched. So on the one side, there's a negative elements about future consumer spending, but this chart shows that consumer spending growth may continue, especially for middle class homeowners due to record high real estate net worth. Let me go into the interest rate, because interest rates, again, is very high. But perhaps further increases in interest rate is already over. So in essence, we are at a cyclical peak, and maybe it will begin to trend down. In fact, the benchmark 10-year Treasury yield, if you were to go to the business school, even master's in business administration, you come out and someone asks you, what is the most one important data point? You may say it's the 10-year Treasury because all other interest rates are pretty much priced off the 10-year Treasury. aside from the Federal Reserve, that monetary policy interest rates. So 10-year Treasury has actually pivoted down already. So as you can see on this daily graph of throughout last year and early part of this year, 10-year Treasury yield went up to 5% back in October. But since then, it has come down. Then it began to move sideways or even a little up. I mean, the 10-year Treasury today is about 4.2%. Briefly, it was somewhat under 4%, but now it's becoming a little above 4%. So if the 10-year Treasury goes down, it will be a great news for commercial real estate. Things like refinancing of the mortgages or even commercial mortgage-backed securities becoming more readily available so people can do the deals, buy and sell commercial real estate properties. So the 10-year Treasury coming down would be very good news. But after the initial decline, it's beginning to flatten out or indicating that all the pivot has already been accomplished with no further anticipation. Well, why did the 10-year Treasury stop declining? One of the reasons is that the consumer price inflation number, which came out, was it yesterday or the 2 days before, is that January consumer price inflation was 3.1%. Overall, consumers are paying 3.1% more now compared to last year. So consumer price inflation at 3.1%. But the Federal Reserve has indicated they want to see the number at 2%. Jay Powell, when he did his 60 Minutes interview, indicated that he would like to see the consumer price inflation at 2%. Now, some of you may say 2%, 3%, what's the big deal? Well, there's an economic textbook. They tried to explain that even a zero inflation is not ideal. You want to have slightly positive inflation, 1 or 2% inflation. So that's what the Federal Reserve wants to accomplish. And also, they want to make sure that one of their mandate, dollar should be a dollar. A couple of summers ago, when you went to the grocery store, dollar was no longer a dollar. Price of eggs sky high. You came out of the grocery shop angry. You said, what happened to my money? Well, the task of the Federal Reserve is to say that dollar should be a dollar, which means that maybe inflation rate of 0, but economists say 0 is not ideal. 1 or 2% would be good. So we are not there yet. So we are close to the 2%, but not there yet. Some economists are saying that trying to bring the inflation to low figures from 9% to 4% or 3%, that's fairly easy. But the last mile to go from 3% to 2% could be difficult. So when does it happen? Is it in the second half of the year? That's when the Federal Reserve begins to cut interest rates? Well, let's wait and see. If we look at some of the specific components, so when the Federal Reserve mentions 2%, what are they saying? Is it the overall consumer price inflation or the core? Core try to eliminate some of the volatile components, things like gasoline prices and food prices. Gasoline prices, food prices are important for us. I mean, we consume that almost every day, so it's important for us. But since it's volatile, Federal Reserve do not want to have a fluctuating monetary policy. 1 month raising interest rate, another month cutting interest rate because of volatile swings in food prices or energy prices. Therefore, eliminating that volatile component is known as the core. Core tend to be much stable. So if we focus on the core, well, the inflation number still is above 2%. And therefore, that's why the Federal Reserve is indicating that, or the Wall Street already incorporating, there will be some delay as to when the Federal Reserve would cut interest rates. One interesting part of the consumer price inflation is the rents. So think about people living in apartments. You know, they are paying rents, and if the rents rise, well, that's what would be reflected here. So according to the government data, the rent component in January is showing 6.1% rise compared to January of 1 year ago. Are you seeing that? And I would say many of you probably are not saying 6.1% anymore. Rent growth was quite strong maybe 2 years ago, but now it is no longer strong. Now, I'm not talking about actual rent declines. So say the rent went from $2,000 to $2,200. But today, maybe it's same as 2,200, so no real change. So that doesn't mean the rents are declining, but the inflation on the rent will be zero. But the government is saying the rents are still rising quite strongly at 6%. The rent component is the heavyweight component of the consumer price inflation. Eggs make up less than 1% weight, but the rents comprise 1/3 weight to the consumer price inflation. So if the rents come down, then automatically overall consumer price inflation will come down. You can see that we are past the cyclical peak, but it's still rising at 6%, twice as high as the overall consumer price inflation. I'm elaborating the consumer price inflation a bit because I'm trying to assess when the Federal Reserve will cut interest rate and by how much, because that interest rate decline will determine the investment activity in the commercial real estate. So what related to the property valuation situation, the commercial capital availability will all depend upon interest rate direction, and the interest rate is in a sense dependent on how the inflation numbers would be. Now, 6.1% inflation really do not make any sense because we are at a 40-year high in apartment construction across the country. 3 consecutive years of 40-year high apartment construction. You see it in Austin, you see it in Nashville, Atlanta, Jacksonville, Charlotte, Raleigh, North Carolina, in many, many markets. Even a mid-sized market like Omaha, Nebraska, you go there, there's a construction crane and you are wondering, what are they building? Most likely they are building apartments. So given that we have so much apartment construction, simple, supply and demand. We have large supply. So if we have large supply, surely rents cannot rise strongly. So why is the rents not coming down? And the private sector data on apartment vacancy is actually showing that through 2023 last year, the apartment vacancy has been rising. And furthermore, based on some of the backlog of the construction that is taking place, that we anticipate that apartment vacancy rate will continue to rise this year. I mean, it's a small growth, but still rising vacancy rate in the private sector data. If we look at the private sector, CoStar data on the rent growth, what we are seeing is the following. The rent growth was strong 2 years ago, 2022. But as you can see, with more supply, economic logic is saying the rent growth will slow and is following that, with the latest quarterly information showing essentially a slight rent decline. I mean, in Austin, Charlotte, they're seeing rent declines. It's not due to the fact that somehow people are saying, oh, I don't want to rent anymore. Rental demand is positive. There are more renters in Austin and Charlotte. It's just that supply is outpacing the demand. So even though there are more renters, supply is just massive, and therefore rent growth has actually turned negative in the private sector data, which is completely opposite of what the government is indicating. So let me actually put 2 graphs together. So the official government data, which Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve are basing their monetary policy decision, will be the blue line. They're saying the rents are rising currently at 6%, while the private sector data, unofficial number, is saying that rents are essentially close to zero. Now, this is not apple-to-apple comparison. Private sector data are apartments, while the government data includes single-family rentals. But when I look at like the Realtor.com, which tracks the listing on the single-family rentals, those rents are actually also in the low single digits and not what the official government is saying. So maybe there is a lag time for the government to catch up with the overall private sector information. But if that is the case, then one can anticipate that the rents in the upcoming months will be much calmer. And if it's calmer, overall consumer price inflation will be lower, giving the opportunity for the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates. Now, this is government data on all rental properties, including single-family rental, and at least regarding vacancy, is showing an uptick. So, you see the axis. So I guess I forgot the decimal point. So it should be 7.0 and then 7.5 and so forth. But the trend line, you can see it on the graph that the apartment vacancy rates, or the rental vacancy rate, including single-family rental, has been rising for the past 18 months. So rents surely would be coming down. One component on the consumer price inflation that is not coming down, and I'm not sure when this thing will come down, is auto insurance. So auto insurance, which before COVID, 2019, as you can see, the early part of the graph, it was like 3%, 4%. Then when COVID hit, people did not drive. So actually insurance, there was less collisions. So the auto insurance rate actually declined. But now it is fast rising. Why is it that if that's the case? Well, the repair costs, car repair costs are rising. Maybe we have a shortage of mechanics. Something for the policymaker here in Washington to think about, because sometimes they are saying, well, let's provide student debt relief. Maybe people do not need to go to university because we need more people to fix cars. We need more people to help build apartments or single family homes. So maybe some blue collar job is what we need rather than white collar job. People continuing to go to college, getting student debt, and then we have this high auto insurance rate. Second thing that's contributing to this high auto insurance rate is rising crime. In DC, every day, carjacking, smashing of the windows to see what's inside. They get caught, then they get released, and then this cycle repeats itself. So this situation may also be contributing to increasing car insurance. So you see the president, the White House coming out recently to say, corporations are raising prices too high, or there's a shrinkflation, meaning that for a package, they're reducing the size of the package and consumers are frustrated by that. Well, if we concentrate on crime, maybe that can also begin to help reduce the inflationary pressure because this is also raising. And of course, from commercial real estate practitioners' perspective, some of the retail shops in downtown area that you are helping to lease out, well, they're shutting down because of increased crime. And now the leasing activity is growing in the suburbs, but not necessarily in the downtown areas because of the increased crime situation in many big cities across the country. But one stubbornly high and somehow refused to come down. So to summarize this rent component, because I'm going to go into the commercial real estate next, is that future rent growth should be calmer. High apartment construction. Therefore, future consumer price inflation should be calmer. And therefore, it allows the Federal Reserve to cut interest rate, except for one potential wild card that could prevent it from happening, which is budget deficit. This is the budget deficit in the US. The orange line shows the tax revenue coming into Washington, while the blue bar shows all government spending on everything, infrastructure, spending on food stamps, spending on national defense. How much of this spending is required for all this border crossing from southern border, illegal crossing? I'm an immigrant. I mean, my parents had to fill out the form. We have to come here legally. I know there are some backlog of legal immigrants coming into the country. But based on my conversation with many, many people, it seems like America is very welcoming towards legal immigrants. But illegal immigrants coming through the southern border, people feel uncomfortable. Who are they coming in? I'm sure some portion of the spending may be related to the illegal immigrant crossing, especially such a large number coming. But What you see on the chart is, especially in 2020, if you go into 2020, what you see is a blowout spending. That's related to COVID. Uncertainty, and therefore you may even say it was justified given the great uncertainty. But look at the spending today. Spending is as if we are still in COVID environment. So spending for 4 straight years, blowout spending, and that's why we have budget deficit, massive issuance of treasury bond. Somebody has to buy. If people are not buying it, then they have to offer higher interest rate. So let me back up a second. It's possible that interest rate could decline, pivot down further because we have massive apartment construction. Inflation will be calmer. But what may prevent it from going down further is this large budget deficit. In fact, if we look at some of the components of budget deficit spending, is that the orange line is national defense spending, and the blue is interest payment. Now, when you have 20 trillion, 100 trillion, what is it? 100% of the GDP as national debt. And then we have higher interest rates. So how much are we paying in interest? Well, that's the blue bar. So this year, it looks like interest payment may actually exceed the national defense spending. So if we don't get the deficit under control, this situation, undesirable situation, may present itself and continue in the future years. In Washington, they're doing something called continuing resolution. Continuing resolution is a fancy word for let's kick the can down the road without really addressing the budget deficit situation. Whatever amount of money we spent last year, let's just continue as before. So constantly in Washington, Senate, Congress, White House, they're doing continuing resolution, which means that this deficit situation may persist, which may prevent any further decline in interest rate because we need to see lower interest rate to get the commercial real estate market going. Now let's look at the interest rate impact on commercial real estate. So this is commercial transaction. Tough environment, especially last year, down 60% from 2 years ago. Now you may say 2 years ago, there was a very active buying and selling of commercial real estate because interest rates were low. So when interest rates are low, people want to buy and sell real estate. They don't want to put their money in the bank, park it in the money in the bank. They want to get some yields, and they're looking at commercial real estate for those yields. But when the interest rates are high, people are saying, well, maybe I want to keep my money in the bank and just get the CD rate of return. And also the refinancing costs on commercial real estate become difficult, so that uncertainty on commercial real estate prevents buyers from confidently entering the market, and consequently very low transactions. This data is from MSCI, which only tracks $2.5 million properties and above. Some of you may be doing $1 million deals or $500,000 deals. They are not reflected in this chart, but we did survey commercial real estate members, realtor members across the country a few years ago. And when we ask, are you doing more transaction, less transaction, and so forth, what we find is that this data point closely replicate what's happening on the smaller, lower price point commercial real estate transactions. So it's been difficult environment for transaction volume in the past year in 2023. What about prices? Well, prices are now below pre-COVID. Red bar is March 2020. So that is the separation line between pre-COVID and post-COVID. So pre-COVID, you see the price. And when we had the lockdown, commercial real estate prices crater. But then low interest rate environment, people wanted to invest in commercial real estate. So prices really went up. But now, as you can see, it's coming down. And now it is below pre-COVID prices. So you need to refinance property. Well, it's going to be difficult because collateral value is not there, especially on office properties. I am in DC office building. When I walk the street, just my rough eyeballing guess, I would say 70% of office spaces are vacant because of remote work combination, not official vacancy. Official vacancy rate is only maybe 15%. But eyeballing the vacancy rate, utilization, I would say the utilization rate is only 30%, with 70% of the spaces being underutilized, either remote work situation, which means that in the future, we may begin to see more sublease spaces coming onto the market on the office spaces. So commercial prices getting hit from higher interest rate, especially on office properties. And let's look at the cap rate situation. So 10-year treasury, the blue bar, the short blue bar that you see, that's the benchmark. And by historical relationship, the implied cap rates would be about 3 percentage points above the 10-year treasury. I mean, it should be above because there's some risk involved in investing in commercial real estate, while investing in government bond is guaranteed, no risk. So because commercial real estate carries some risk, the cap rate is a little above that implied cap rate. So I'll put that blue bar as to where the implied cap rate should be. So what this chart shows is that for office, maybe the property prices have adjusted downward enough so that now it is about what it should be. But if you look at other commercial properties, apartments, cap rate still too low. Maybe there need to be some price concession to sell apartment buildings. Now, if you are representing apartment owners, you may say, well, demand is still positive. Of course, there's a lot of supply, but demand is positive. The rents are not as strong, but we're still collecting rents. So why should I lower prices? And the reason why you need to lower prices is that there are not that many buyers. Buyers are saying at higher interest rate, I cannot buy that apartment building producing that's only 6% cap rates. So maybe there is a room for apartment prices to come down. Same thing for industrial, retail, but the office, at least this simplistic chart is implying the office prices have come down sufficiently so that it is at the implied cap rate condition. Now, what is not shown on this chart, but still relevant, is the following. The green bar. So the red and the blue is exactly the same. So let me go back to the prior chart. Red and the blue is exactly the same. I only added the green. So what is green? Green is rent growth. So what this chart is saying is, let's look at industrial. Industrial rent growth is solid, nearly 7%. So even though the cap rate is a little low, you may say, well, I don't care. I'm not too concerned because rent growth will continue and therefore the rents will bring higher income and therefore once interest rate decline even slightly, it will be properly valued. While you look at the office, rent growth is minimal. I mean, that is below consumer price inflation, below the maintenance costs. So your operating expense in office is running high, yet rent growth is only 1%. You see on the retail sort of neutral, while apartment rent is negative, but this is only temporary because we are already seeing some of the permitting of multifamily is really coming down, which means future construction on apartment is not there. So I think the apartment rent after 1 or 2 years of oversupply situation will quickly turn positive. So someone with a long-term horizon may say that apartment rent growth would be solid 2-3 years from now. So I'm not concerned about this 1-year fluke with oversupply situation. And the other concern on the commercial real estate is that the community banks are the ones who are holding on to a large portion of commercial real estate loans. So the red line shows all the commercial real estate loan held by small size banks, excluding the top 25, or the top 25 is the blue. So JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, for the most part, they have stayed away from commercial real estate. Well, it's the community banks that has been the source of the loan for the commercial real estate. Let me now turn towards the economy and the commercial real estate. Actually, let me quickly summarize the prior section. Prior section is saying commercial real estate transaction fell. So if you specialize in investment sales, it was a difficult year. Only way to revive investment sale is for the interest rates to decline. So interest rate decline, there will be some revival on investment sales. If you are involved in leasing activity, well, here it is, economy and commercial real estate. So economy determines job growth, and job growth determines consumer spending, like at the retail shop, industrial spaces. So the leasing activity would be more related to the economy. And the economic data, the most recent data is showing 3.3% growth, which would be considered very solid. Economists, when they look at GDP, anything above 3% will be considered very, very solid. In the middle is a jerky reaction from lockdown and reopening economy. In fact, I had to cut off the figure at 10% because the figure is actually like minus 30 and plus 30. So if I included the full graph, the other graph really doesn't show. So I had to cut that off. But there was a knee-jerk reaction from lockdown and reopening the economy. But as you can see, recent data is fairly solid. This is a single quarter. If you look at the annual data, annual across 4 quarters, 2023 was decent. It was 2.2%, which would be considered decent, not spectacular. So across 4 quarters, it was a decent activity. And consequently, jobs are being added with each passing month. So graph begins right before COVID, before the ugly virus, arrival of the ugly virus. And in April is reflecting the lockdown period, that huge disruption, but the reopening of the economy, with Georgia being the first state to reopen its economy, soon followed by Florida and Texas, the reopening of the economy led to more job creation, more job creation. I think Pennsylvania was the last to reopen its economy. I know many realtors in Pennsylvania were frustrated at the governor. Why don't you let us do our work? But Pennsylvania had a severe lockdown. Monthly job addition, so not total job, but how many new jobs each passing month. And you can see that recently, the job gains are a little lighter compared to what it had been in the early part of the reopening of the economy. Now, this being 2024 presidential election year, if that number was to turn negative, it's going to be really bad news for President Biden. But if the number remains positive or even strengthens, it's going to be good news for President Biden, other things equal. I'm sure that many people are looking at social issues, border crisis, or maybe deficit situation, but some people vote on how they feel about the job. And the job market so far has been solid and is in fact sort of strengthening in the past couple of months on the jobs front. But where are the jobs really being added? And it's being added in the dark blue states. It's not a political map. I just randomly chose the figure. Dark blue is very good. So Rocky Mountain states are good, like Nevada, where Super Bowl was recently held in Las Vegas. 10.6% growth in Nevada in terms of job growth. How many jobs now compared to pre-COVID? So Rocky Mountain states doing well, Texas doing well, Florida doing well, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia doing well. Light blue is in the middle, nothing spectacular. And then you see, for example, few orange, which have not fully recovered. That would be Vermont, Rhode Island, and Hawaii. Large state, New York. If you can identify where New York is, fourth grader question, identify where New York. Well, when you go to New York, it's showing 0.1. That is to say, New York really have not added any job over the past 3 years as they went to the lockdown and recovering, only 0.1% job addition. Within the New England state, New Jersey and Delaware is a better performer in the sort of the northeastern state. So you see job variation across the country. So let me go back. This is the monthly job addition. This is total job. And if you're wondering where these jobs are coming from, it's essentially coming from this dark blue color coded state where the jobs are being added. Commercial real estate practitioner, That is a demand for retail spaces. That is a demand for industrial spaces. That is a demand for apartment spaces. To some extent, it could even be demand for office spaces, possibly. So you need job in order to get the commercial real estate, at least the leasing activity going. Some of the transaction activity may be more influenced by interest rates, not about jobs. So commercial transaction activity more important from interest rates, while for leasing, it would be more related to the job market condition. And just as an illustration, Texas, this is the picture from 3 years prior to COVID and 3 years after. In the middle is the lockdown. So you can see that in this time frame, in the state of Texas, added 2 million more jobs from 2017 to 2023. 2 million more jobs. By contrast, neighboring state in Louisiana, well, virtually no job addition in Louisiana with the COVID disruption happening in the middle. One thing that is sort of frustrating on the labor market condition is the following. We are adding jobs, which is a good thing, but the number of people who are out of the labor force remains stubbornly high. Who are out of the labor force? Well, people who are retired. They should not be working. They're retired. Thank you for all your work in the past, but now you are 65 or 70 years old. You want to enjoy your retirement years. Well, you are out of the labor force. Students, they're out of the labor force. But then you have others who are not looking for a job. You have to be looking for a job to be in the labor force, but here it shows how many people are out of the labor force, including those not looking for a job. The middle of the graph is COVID. So you can say that 96 million Americans, combination of retirees, students not looking for work, they're out of the labor force, 96 million before COVID. But after COVID, it's stubbornly remaining at 100 million, refused to go down. And that is why we're seeing help wanted sign, help wanted sign, help wanted sign in many, many places. And some policymakers say, well, there's a labor shortage, so why don't we bring more immigrants to the country? So border crisis is not a crisis for people who say there's too many help wanted sign, because we need the labor, we need dishwashers, we need people who can do manual repetitive task type of work. But maybe if we had more people searching for job, maybe we don't need immigrants to occupy those jobs. But anyway, right now we are high on people who are out of the labor force, which is causing many help wanted signs to be posted at restaurants, hotels, and many other venues. Now, the wage growth contribute to the consumer price inflation eventually, because if the company has to pay this, then they may not be able to bring the consumer price inflation down too much. So what we are seeing is that we have seen some decelerating wage growth. So wage growth is rising. Right now is about 4.5%, but maybe going down to 3.5% would be comfortable in terms of bringing the overall consumer price inflation down. Again, contributor, not the major force, but the wage growth right now is at 4%. Just in case you have to hire an admin, this is what you need to pay. After 1 year, you have to give them about 4.5% more based on the labor market condition. Unemployment rate super low. In the middle is COVID lockdown, but low unemployment partly is due to people being out of the labor force. If we have more people entering the labor force, then we would not have such a low unemployment rate, nor many of the help wanted sign will be taken down because domestic workers will be taking on those jobs. Now let's look at the job market impact on leasing. The number of people who would traditionally work in offices. You may have heard professional business service sector. Those are the consultants, accountants, lawyers, people who essentially work in offices. That job has risen. So even as the job on people who used to work in office has risen over this job creation, people are not leasing out more office spaces. I put the data all the way to the second quarter. Somehow my staff cannot pull out the third quarter information. So for the fourth quarter, I added towards the end. So office absorption is still negative. They're giving up more spaces. Vacancy rate still rising. If we look at the national office vacancy rate, as you can see, 2023, still trying to tally up that figure. It looks like that. I think 2024, it will continue to increase in the office vacancy, especially subleasing spaces will reach the market, or people who used to occupy one floor of a building now say they're going to occupy only half a floor of a building and other half sublease it out. So vacancy to be continuing to rise. I will not be surprised even up to 2025. If we look at change in vacancy rate, what we are finding is that essentially there's one outlier way on the right, that's San Francisco. So compared to pre-COVID to now, how much increase in vacancy? Well, San Francisco is an outlier. I think we all know why. Dirty, crime-ridden, people do not want to go there. And we also have to consider like social policy impact. Before COVID, number of drug overdoses in San Francisco was about 200. 200 people died from drug overdose in San Francisco. Today it is 800. That increase, is it due to the social policy, or is it due to the fentanyl reaching the San Francisco streets? What is the reason? I mean, these are the most vulnerable Americans dying on the street. And it's just a sad situation that additional number of Americans are dying in the street, with especially office vacancy rate rising just tremendously in San Francisco. Other big cities, you can see nearly every metro market, higher vacancy, office vacancy now compared to pre-COVID condition. Leasing, retail leasing positive. So the early part shows the lockdown impact, but after the lockdown, restaurants, nail salons, gymnasiums, yoga studios, they want to lease out spaces, so it's positive. So if you are involved in leasing, it is positive, 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 with the fourth quarter still showing positive or even strengthening condition. In that retail vacancy rate consequently went down, but when I look at the pipeline, how much new construction of the retail spaces based on that metrics, I think the vacancy rate will remain stable. It's not going to decline any further. If we look at the warehouse industrial spaces, positive throughout, even during COVID. Amazon is continuing to benefit from online shopping situation. So positive. Only caveat is it's not super strong anymore. So it used to be super strong, it's still positive, but not the super strong situation. The warehouse vacancy, there's so much construction activity in the pipeline, so the vacancy rate will tick up a bit. So those solid rent growth may come down slightly on the warehouses, but by historical standards, the vacancy rate this year is expected to be below pre-COVID condition. Now, hotel occupancies. In the hotel, it's not vacancy, but occupancy. 2020, people did not travel, lockdown, but now, as you can see, is rising above pre-COVID conditions. So maybe remote work, some people take advantage of that lengthy remote work situation. Maybe over the weekend, they say, let's go to another city and I can work remotely from a hotel room. So consequently, this occupancy is really about travel, not business travel, but more leisure travel or remote work travel that is happening. Long-term interest rates. So let's start going into the forecast. Let me see how much time I have and the speed that I need to cover. Oh, wow, I'm just been talking way too much. Long-term interest rate to decline. So rents will calm down, which will hold down consumer price inflation, which will make the Fed to cut interest rate. I already went over that. But the second reason why I think there will be long-term interest rate decline is that Federal Reserve does not want to talk about the community banks, but the community banks are suffering because of higher interest rates. Remember Silicon Valley Bank, which went under 1 year ago? There are many similar situations for community bank, except for the fact that Federal Reserve put a special credit line. That credit line is set to expire next month. which means that we may see more community bank beginning to suffer unless interest rate decline or they extend the credit line. So community banks, only way to help them is to cut interest rate and to prevent a similar situation as Silicon Valley Bank. There's added incentive for the Fed to cut interest rate. And the spread with the benchmark 10-year treasury with other long-term interest rate are right now abnormally high. And once this abnormality disappears, it will also make the interest rate a little calmer. Sorry that I'm running out of time, so I cannot explain in detail on that reasoning. So let me just advance. Let me go quickly on the housing market. So home sales were low. I mean, this chart, by the way, will all be available for your own perusal at your leisure. Gina will send this out to all the attendees. So home sales were low, but for commercial real estate, it's about land development. So new home sales, they had a third best year ever. And the reason why the home builders were doing well, even though the realtors were challenged, is because of inventory situation. So on existing home, low inventory, but builders can create inventory, compensate for that low inventory by creating more inventory. That means they need to purchase land. It means they need to put the land into developable lots, and then lot becomes a subdivision and start putting new homes. So to the extent that you are exposed to new home building, land purchases, you are in a good shape. In fact, we are in a housing shortage. So even though it was the third best year, you can see that it's been a decade of underproduction. And that's why we have a housing shortage, and this residual housing shortage will continue for the next few years, 3-4 years. So build more homes, purchase land, especially in a fast growing market, Florida, Texas, Rocky Mountain State, that is needed. Let me, for the sake of time, just move it on. So the forecast is that home sales, I think, will steadily recover. And we are already seeing upturn in some pending contracts with mortgage rate coming down somewhat from the highs back in October. And the outlook is essentially the following. So this is the next to last slide because I want to take a few questions. So the outlook overall is Fed to cut interest rate. In my view, it's going to be about 4 or 5 times more rounds of rate cut than what the Federal Reserve has said. And the reasoning is community bank. I think they really need to help out the community bank. And second, future rent growth would be very calm, and that will help on the consumer price inflation. So as the interest rate decline, it will stabilize commercial real estate prices, except for office. Office, I think, will continue to decline for maybe another year. Transaction opportunity will improve because of lower interest rate and more capital availability. Leasing opportunity will continue to improve because we are in a job creating environment, especially in those states with fast job creation. So leasing opportunity continue to open up. And for some of you who are involved in land, single family development, that will do well. We are in housing shortage. So position yourself. This is where the business opportunity will likely play out. I'm trying to assess all the logic behind the story. So with that, thank you for joining and thank you for your patience. Now I'm going to turn it over to Gina.
We do have some questions that have come through. I want to start with this one here. Many communities across the nation are facing a housing crisis. And if housing is built, whether that is single family or apartments, adding supply will outpace demand and rent should decrease. However, municipal regulations combined with higher interest rates are not allowing developers to build. This is combined with higher cost of construction. How are communities supposed to logically add housing supply into the market?
Yeah, that is a very good question, especially more affordable housing, whether it's affordable rental housing or the affordable price single family housing, because numbers don't work unless there is some kind of tax credit. I mean, for things like the long-term tax credit for rental housing development, maybe they need to enlarge that, provide more money availability. And also, we are talking to members of Congress, we meaning the National Association of Realtors, because we hear from the realtors, we relay that message, and of course, through some RPAC money. They like to listen to what we have to say. We say consider affordable housing needs as infrastructure spending. We need bridges, we need better highways, but we also need housing, especially affordable housing where the numbers do not work on its own from the private sector. So in order to make more moderately priced homes supply available, let's consider infrastructure spending, carve out some of that money for housing construction. I was in Fayetteville, North Carolina. It's fairly affordable area, but someone told me that Raleigh, which is not far away, and Raleigh home prices have risen, apartment rent prices have risen. So you would naturally think that it would bleed out, meaning that people will move to more affordable region like Fayetteville. But somehow the Fayetteville City Council refused to allow new development. That is so frustrating. Why would you not allow more development and lead to housing shortage? Very good question. Many are at the local level. It requires local discussion, but at the federal, I already mentioned about tax credit, maybe turning some of the infrastructure spending into housing spending.
Thank you, Lawrence. On that same note, let's talk a little bit about multifamily foreclosures that you mentioned. Do you see evidence or foresee an increase in the multifamily foreclosure rate in 2024 as the loans are due amid the much higher interest rates that we're seeing?
The community bank, again, some are in a more precarious position in terms of balance sheet. So therefore, under normal circumstances, maybe they work out those loans, even at higher refinancing rate. Collateral value has fallen somewhat, so they try to work it out. But those community banks which are in dire need of cash, they said, no, we cannot, work it out. So you may see a more increase of foreclosure condition for all commercial properties. Office definitely, but even some retail and multifamily situation just because of this high refinancing. And some of you listeners, for you, some of your listeners, because you are looking at distress sales or distress purchases, you be on the lookout because it will be ticking a little upwards. Definitely not like 2010 period, like the Great Recession, but we have had exceptionally low foreclosure rate on commercial properties. I think it's going to tick up somewhat.
We have time for one more question, Lawrence. If the employment numbers continue to come in strong and inflation remains high, what impact do you expect this to have on the Fed's potential interest rate cuts?
So let's look at the scenario. So employment numbers come high, and then the inflation continues to remain hot. If that's the case, the Federal Reserve cannot cut interest rate because Jay Powell has publicly been stating he wants to see 2%. So for him to cut interest rate when the inflation is running 3% or 4%, it would be counter to what he has already publicly stated. So if under that scenario, interest rate will remain high. In fact, some of the pivoting down that has already occurred may revert back upwards. And we have higher interest rate, very bad news in terms of, again, refinancing those loans or even trying to get the capital for purchases. Now, leasing will continue to expand because of the job growth situation.
Excellent. Lawrence, thank you for joining us. And thank you all for attending today's webinar. And as a reminder, the recording and accompanying presentation will be emailed to all registered attendees. That is all we have for today. Appreciate your time and have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.